In CSS, we have this concept of the parent-child relationship based on the structure of the HTML document. Every element will have a parent at some point. And we have this concept when applying styles that children inherit from parents. So it makes sense that if we apply a style to an element, children elements will also have that same style being applied to them. And when I say children, I also mean the grandchildren, etc. So here we see an example of the styles being applied to the body tag. This is very common. We often will apply styles that we want everywhere to the body tag, and these are referred to as global styles, as they affect everything in the page. I would like to point out that not all styles are inherited. The box style properties, such as margin, padding, and border, are not inherited. We have in CSS the concept of the cascade. The cascade indicates the rules of order in which styles are applied in the event of a conflict. And I would like to emphasize that word conflict. So if we have several rules applying a property value to the same area, there is a way that we can determine which one will take precedence. And here we have the style sheet hierarchy. Reading from the bottom up, the important directive will take precedence first, then the inline style, embedded style, the @imports, the link, the user settings if they exist, and the browser defaults. So essentially, the closest rule to the element will take precedence. So here we have an example. In our embedded style section here, we have 3 P selectors, and we have a color property being set with 3 different values. In the body, we have 1 P. Which color will the text be? Well, it is pretty obvious because I made it blue. However, the last style will apply because literally this is the closest. Now we have another situation. If we look in the body section, we have a P. It has an ID attribute and a class attribute. Now if we look at the embedded style section, we see we have an ID selector, a class selector, and an element selector. Again, they all have the color property being set with a different value being applied. So which color will the text be? Again, I have it colored blue so that the ID selector #para will take precedence. You might ask why. We also have in CSS this concept of specificity. An ID is more specific than a class. A class is more specific than a P. So these rules also factor in to which styles will be applied, again, in the event of a conflict. Specificity refers to the fact that more specific selectors will have more weight when it comes to styling conflict rules. In a simple highest order, inline styles come first, IDs next, classes next, and element selectors last. We also have this concept of a specificity calculator. How this works is we have 4 columns, as you can see. And you would look at the style and add a point in each column to which it applies. And the columns are laid out in order of precedence. The first column is inline, the second column is ID, the third column is not only class, but an attribute or a pseudo-class selector, and the fourth column is an element or a pseudo-element selector. So whichever highest column has the most points, that rule will win with respect to those styles being applied in the event of a conflict. So let's look at the first section of code here. Now I only have 3 columns because there are no inline styles. The first selector is a P. It is the element selector. Therefore, we put a 1 in the rightmost column. The next selector, block quote space P, that is a descendant selector. There are 2 elements in that selector. Therefore, we put a 2 in the rightmost column. The next selector, P.intro, that is a class selector tied into the P element. That selector has a class selector, so we put a 1 in the second column. It also has an element selector, so we put a 1 in the third column. The middle column is the highest level column. Therefore, the last selector wins because there is a 1 in that middle column. Let's take a look at the other code example here. We have pound meadow, which is an ID selector, and now we have an attribute selector, asterisk, bracket, ID equals meadow. They're almost identical. However, technically they are different. Let's take a look at our column rating. Now we have all 4 columns sitting here. Pound meadow is an ID selector, therefore a 1 goes into the second column. Asterisk, bracket ID equals meadow is an attribute selector, therefore a 1 goes into the third column. Therefore, pound meadow will take precedence because that is the more specific selector. And this is a very interesting and easy way to figure out when it comes to having long, complex selectors. So now let's take a look at this example. In the body, we have a section element with an ID. We have an H2. The H2 contains a paragraph. The paragraph has a class. So the question is, what color will the text be? And you can see that it will be red because I have it colored red. Let's take a look at our specificity. Here we have 3 selectors, pound intro, red, a class, and the H2 selector. They are all being styled with the color property set to different values. However, the class will take precedence because it is more specific. It is being applied directly to the P. Should the class had not been there, then the H2 would have taken precedence. I would like to point out that the purpose of the cascade and specificity is to determine which style will be applied in the event of a conflict. However, the other rules will still apply. You will have styles being applied to the same area that are coming in from a variety of different selectors. So let's take a look at what we have again. I have added some additional properties to our selectors, and I have added the body selector. So our content will inherit from the body, the font family, and the font size. Because the content is located inside the section element, it will inherit the background color from the ID selector. The color property will be applied from the class of red, and the font style will be inherited from the H2. Even though we are specifying which style will apply for color because we have a conflict, the other properties where there is no conflict will still be applied. The important declaration. The important declaration takes precedence over any cascade or specificity. The important declaration is not rated in the specificity calculator. I would also like to talk about the asterisk selector, and that is represented by the symbol on top of the number 8 key, and that represents all elements. And I would like to point out that that should be used with caution. Here's an example. Applying a border to every element in the page is not the same as applying a border to the body. Applying a border to the body will just put it around the outside of the content. It will not be inherited. However, the asterisk will apply to every element anywhere in that web page. An excellent way to find out what is going on in your CSS code and to debug any problems you may have in your web page is to use the browser development tools. You can merely right-click on any part of the page and choose Inspect. It will bring up a dialog. At the right-hand corner, I have 3 colons. If I click on that, it will show me how to dock this little box here. It may originally show up on the right. You may not want it on the right. I prefer it on the bottom, so I change the position. You can do this with any web page. When you select the content and right-click on it, it will highlight it in the web page. Notice when I put my cursor over the HTML code, it highlights the content here in my document, and it also tells me something about it. Should I wish to find out some information about it, I can look at the right-hand pane, Styles. I can see that there's my class of red being applied. I can see where my cascade has been applied. Notice we see the H2 with the color, and notice it's crossed out. It means that that was applied to that area. However, the cascade has canceled it out. However, we still have the font style being applied. Now, some of these are coming from the browser, so you have to ignore them. Again, here's pound intro. It's showing us this color property is crossed out. However, the background has been applied. Here, it's showing us some additional information. This is a very valuable tool. Another thing you can do, as you see when I hover over it, I get this check mark. I can actually unclick the check mark and disable it. So if you look into the web page, you can see how it would look without that style. Also, if I click in here, I can change values. So this is actually a very nice way of testing. And by the way, when I change the value and I disable it, it doesn't stay in the code. It's just on the screen here. It's a very nice way of finding out about what's going on in your document, seeing your styles, and also looking at how things might look if you made some changes.